Well, we have some major breaking news out of the war in Syria. Things have certainly heated up again. I've been following what's going on in Idlib, sort of loosely, not too much dedication, but I figured it was something worth keeping an eye on. And lo and behold, something big happened just the other day here, or I guess I'm not exactly sure what the time difference, but I think it was yesterday. Essentially, the Turks have been trying to move into Idlib, which of course is sort of the last stand of the jihadis in Syria. It's the one geographic location that they actually have control over, and that the Assad government does not have much of a presence. And Turkey wanted to make sure that Idlib did not fall to Assad and the Damascus government. And so they had this operation where they were, initially I guess they tried to negotiate to get Assad to surrender so that Turkey could just move in and occupy the city, and that didn't happen because, understandably, Assad sees no reason why he should hand over a city in his country to the Turks to occupy it. And so the Turks decided that they were going to move in and try and take over a bunch of these observation posts throughout the city. And when they moved into one of them, they were, shelled or bombed. I'm not exactly sure which. Might have been both, honestly, both artillery and, planes, because apparently by the Russians and the Syrians, we're hearing. And this attack on the Turks, I guess, killed about 34 men. So it was a pretty serious operation, and this is being considered to be a pretty serious escalation. The Turks certainly seem to be interpreting this as a serious escalation. And so it's hard to tell if at this point, considering that, you have a Turkish army invading Syria, you have Syrians and Russians, killing Turks, you have Turks killing Syrians. Can you call this a war at this point? I mean, isn't that what this is? Isn't Turkey at war with Syria? It's difficult to say because, countries don't have declarations of war anymore like they used to. That used to be the old-fashioned way, was you would have your parliament or whatever draw up this declaration of war, and then the head of state would sign it, and then, it would be understood that you are at war with a particular country. Nobody's done that since World War II. So in this case, again, it's hard to say whether they're at war or not, but it certainly looks like it to me. And the Turks are not, just holding Assad and Putin accountable for this attack. They seem to be holding the Europeans, the EU, and NATO accountable for this attack because nobody's come to Turkey's aid. Turkey's been trying to get, I guess, the U.S. involved in Syria. They wanted some backup so that they felt like that they had impunity to go after, Assad and his government. But thankfully, the U.S., from what I've been hearing, has, not really shown any interest in getting back involved in the war with Syria to try and take down Assad. The Americans seem to have correctly interpreted after all these many years that, Assad's not just going to go that easily. And if you do take him down, there's going to be a lot of trouble that nobody, frankly, wants to deal with right now. And so if Erdogan wants to go and, knock over Assad, he's going to have to clean up that mess all by himself. But Erdogan apparently doesn't like that. He doesn't like just being given, permission to do this. He wants outright assistance, I guess. So he's opened up the floodgates now, or frankly, opened up the gates of hell to Europe, and has said, hey, any Syrian refugees that want to go find a better life in Europe, go ahead and do that. We're not going to stop you. Whereas, for the entirety of the Syrian civil war, Turkey had been, absorbing the Syrian refugees or stopping them at the border and keeping, at least a large portion of them out of Europe. Obviously, there were millions of people who fled to Europe, but most of those were not actually Syrian. They were from Africa. They were people who claimed to be Syrian refugees, but for the most part were not, and ended up in places like Sweden and Germany. I believe 1 year Germany took in 1 million refugees, 1% of their population. And like I said, most of those were not Syrian. But now you do have genuine Syrian refugees flowing both from Turkey, I'm sure, and from Syria. Because remember, Turkey accepted a huge number of refugees that are still in their country that are costing them a lot of money to keep alive. This is not a great situation. The Turks, I'm sure, do not want these refugees around, and this really has been an albatross hanging over Europe's neck. It really has given Erdogan a lot of leverage over them, so that they haven't been as probably I guess, disapproving of Erdogan and his so-called reforms as they might have otherwise been. Of course, Erdogan has gone from, has taken Turkey from a potential, EU member state into a somewhat of a autocracy. I don't want to overstate it and make him sound like he's Hitler or Franco, but he's not all powerful, but he's a pretty darn strong guy who's been in power there for a long time and pretty much is the one in charge. And that's not something that Europeans, tend to approve of. They always look down their nose at dictators. But they can hardly do that now because, he's got them over a barrel. He's sending those refugees over, and, the message is pretty clear. Hey, help me deal with this mess, or else I'm going to make it your mess. Because now it is Europe's mess. Now the Syrian war that nobody wanted to be involved with because they said, hey, it's none of our business, we have nothing to gain there. Well, now you do have something to gain, or at least you have a lot to lose if you don't get involved. That's what Erdogan is trying to say here. He's blackmailing the Europeans into getting involved in this war. Or moreover, I should say, he is blackmailing the Europeans into pressuring the Americans to get involved in this war because, what are the Europeans going to do? Britain's out of the European Union. They're not going to do anything now. But I guess France and Germany, is that what they're holding out hope for? The Poles, I don't think, are going to get involved. The Poles are just going to, close their borders and say, no Syrians in here, please. We've had enough of those. And the same thing with Hungary. So I guess that's what Erdogan is hoping for here. France and Germany coming in. But either way, whatever his end goal is here, his actions are going to put the Syrian war back on the map for many people. It's going to bring it back into the news, at least in Europe, but also probably to a certain extent here in the United States. But, I don't think that this, will sway public opinion in the United States about the war in Syria. I don't think that anyone here will want to get involved over there. Of course, it will be interesting to see what happens when you have this mass of people from Syria flooding into Europe when they're already, trying to deal with the Wu flu now, because a lot of these, I'm sure, are going to go to Italy. I wonder what kind of chaos will be created by a combination of, Syrian refugees flooding into Europe and this massive pandemic. Those two things, especially when you've got these refugee camps of people with close quarters. I mean, the Wu flu would just tear right through them. But at the very least, in the short term now, we would expect that Erdogan's probably going to commit more forces to this war in Syria and is going to go all out in trying to defend Idlib, which, theoretically, he should be able to do, because, bringing in fresh troops, and, Turkey is a pretty sizable military by world standards. Syria has been beat down after over a decade of civil war. You would think that their military might be a little tired. And, of course, they've been fighting insurgents, not a regular army, so things are a little different in that respect. You kind of would have to retool to go from fighting an unconventional war to a conventional war, which is presumably the sorts of combat they'd be engaged with against the Turks. So it's a very fluid-moving situation, and I might have another update on it later in the weekend. But until then, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you liking this video and subscribing. And if you haven't already, please do wash your hands, because, you never know, the Wu flu can be anywhere. So with that said, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.